Hello, I'm Greg. Welcome back to our exploration of authority. Where does it come from? How did authority develop in the first place? We need to know these kinds of things if we're going to question it incisively, pointedly, and as radically as possible, and compel authority to explain itself to us so that we can evaluate it. And indeed, in a democracy and also in perhaps less democratic institutions, such as our educational institutions, especially, these skills are at a premium and are, I believe, as a philosopher, crucial not only to our general human freedom, but to our sense of what a good society is, a healthy polis, a healthy kind of community, as well as, of course, authentic relationships with others, including intimate others. So all of this is at stake, which seems like a lot, but let's continue to explore this idea together. This second part of our interpretation of text is called the problem of meaning. We're going to continue where we left off. We were talking about the discovery of the key to the code of Egyptian hieroglyphics and all that implied. Then that was happening at the same time as the generalization of this hermeneutic sensibility, this idea that any kind of text, not just scripture, sacred texts, is open to question, and therefore the idea that the authority comes from the word takes hold, but at the same time, then this authority is disputed, leavened, tempered, and most importantly, questioned in an ongoing manner. Okay. So back to this hieroglyphic thing. First of all, if we think about this for a moment, we realize that in this older form of language and writing, it was taken to represent a quality that human beings could not entirely comprehend. Hieroglyphic writings contained an otherworldly voice. Yet even here, because these worldviews held that the gods regularly consorted with human beings, and indeed sometimes transformed themselves into humans, though with the caveat that they always retained their extra-mundane abilities, writing from this period of human consciousness was itself seen as not wholly human. This makes sense insofar as the sheer presence of writing, with its revolutionary qualities concerning human memory, must at first have seemed like a gift from the beyond. An oral culture has no means of verification outside of either the moment of experience itself or, and especially so, without mortal memory. Even in our own time, we remain concerned about the passing of those who were present in a crisis, such as the Holocaust. The denial of history is at once the incipient suasion necessary to rewrite it, as well as being tantamount to annulling the very existence of those upon whom history descended, like the apocalypse. Writing overcomes much of this pushback, and in so doing reveals the human imagination to be at the least of a dual character. Inasmuch as one can deny something, one can also affirm it. Denial is not a default setting for the human conscience. It is quite otherwise in general, if one has any integrity at all, and thus writing promotes a kind of vanguard ethics. In this, it betrays its link with mythos, wherein the gods were generally seen to have a superior sensibility about them, even if they did not always act upon it. And if the book is more than sacred, as the song declares, it is precisely due to writing being able to defend the truth of things, while at the same time acknowledge that things and truths may be distinct, and that perspective is a vital source of meaningfulness. After all, every piece of writing was done by a writer, a child of the creator, author, and thus we are once again thrust back into the ring wherein intent and authority combine to make matters less clear. And this is so not because mythos does itself survive the advent of logos, just as oral narrative is today at best the hobby of nostalgic virtuosos whose theater is more spontaneous and improvisatory than that of most writers. No. What preserves the nebulous nature of meaning in writing is rather the presence of language use in the face of language itself. Now, what am I meaning by such a distinction? It's go back to Ferdinand de Saussure, the generally thought of as the founder of modern or contemporary linguistics. And Saussure distinguishes between synchronic relations and those diachronic. If we think of a sentence as being splayed out along an x-axis, its very anatomy exposed in as literal a sense as one could muster. Nevertheless, our very understanding of the sentential sense is bulwarked by all of the meanings that we cast adrift in making the decision to interpret the sentence in this way and no other. And remember that when we're inferring meaning, it is a choice that we make. We are making a specific kind of decision to say, okay, I think that they mean this rather than this. Okay, and it's something that much of the time in the day-to-day we do not do consciously, but when we're kind of analyzing text and submitting authority to a test, then we must be absolutely alert to the sense that we're making decisions all along the way. So each word in a sentence also has a y-axis which intersects it. The proverbial "he married his daughter" is, with a few historical exceptions, only sensible if the male agent is a priest or minister of some kind. This example is not meant to be taken as a riddle per se, but one can immediately see that within every sentence, the native speaker of the language at hand is confronted with a puzzle which involves intent, meaning, authority, and context. That we are able, almost automatically, to walk through this otherwise daunting thicket of potential meanings is testament to not only our linguistic literacy, but also that cultural. Alfred Schutz remarks as a non-native English speaker that if one does not know both the Bible and Shakespeare, one is often lost. There are just that many allusions, or yet outright quotations from both sources, that we who speak English as our native tongue mostly do not even recognize them. I certainly don't. And to be fair and less leading, one would generally phrase the nuptial scene more akin to "he performed the marriage ceremony for his daughter," or such like. If one was moving in the opposite direction, one might conjure truer riddles which test the literacy of the native speaker involved, but these kinds of efforts tend to be those of showboats and culture snobs, and thus do not fall within the normative parameters of Saussurean relations. This said, the synchronic axis is ever threatening to displace meaning. This is one of the points in Jacques Derrida's great corpus of work early on. So if we're honest about the sentential, we must admit to ourselves that meaning, because it differs along the y-axis, is then deferred along the x-axis. This is one of Derrida's, of course, patent points now. The dialectical apex of this particular triangle, one of at least 5 in Saussure's analysis, is of course the now proverbial différance. Interpreting text requires of us the suspension of this dynamic, which is precisely what, according to Derrida, cannot be done. Meaning is thus wholly given over to meaningfulness, which is itself somewhat delusory. This is not a nihilistic interpretation of the function of language in use, but simply an acknowledgement that how language itself works involves this constant presence of a kind of non-presence. The langage as pharmacon sensibility, okay, this is something that Derrida makes great mileage out of, is a useful one as it backdrops as much as it sabotages hermeneutics and is itself an exemplar of the hermeneutic trial, in which it risks its own being just as do we upon entering its open circle. Text itself, then, is an outcome of a number of conflicting sources and forces. On the one hand, we have the transmutation of mythos into structural meaning, and on the other, the newer presence of the logos translated into context. For the case at hand, and for the time being, the latter is seen to trump the former. We can decide upon a meaning after all, and we do so by infusing its différance with the meaningfulness of contextualized consciousness. Even so, we remain aware that the next time round meanings can shift, and what was the truth of this time and place and for these persons is no longer, indeed none of it. This should not disturb us, and we now understand with some half-century or so of reflection on the post-structural critique that difference may be overdone at the expense of both context and even homology. This is also the case in general, for we are, after all, a single and singular species which shares both consciousness and conscience. The differing along the y-axis, where each word has in itself multiple meanings, and one must then choose the most likely one, given all of the other words attached to the utterance or piece of writing, and the differing along the x-axis, precisely due to this ever-present instant of decision, do not obviate that all of this still takes place within a human language, and thus also is part of human language in itself. Yet, we have touched upon one of the core analytic reasons why meaning can be so disputed in the first place, right? I mean, this is, in some ways, this is the whole thing right in front of us, right? That people have different senses of what is correct, what is right, what is the truth. And, of course, backdropping all of that, what does this or that actually mean to them? Okay? And at the same time, we're very aware that truth is not idiosyncratic. It isn't a world where every single person has a different truth. Otherwise, there would be no culture at all. There would be no sense of belief. There would be nothing that we could share and understand one another. Clearly, this is not the case. We're somewhere in between there. Paul Ricoeur, the great post-war philosopher and ethicist, calls this famously the conflict of interpretation, okay? Why meaning can be so disputed, and this far beyond any specific politics or individual desires. This conflict of interpretations is part of the essence of the medium itself, and from its very beginnings, it is not at all a coincidence that the first writings known are of two genres, epic narrative and warehouse records. These were, at the time, the most literal expressions of meaning that could be imagined. Since everyone knew the myths through orality or from oral narrative, their versions were understood as aspects of poetic license rather than egotistic licentiousness. To write them down was not so much to codify them, but rather to simply affirm them. Records of early commodities stored for either purposes of trade or seasonal consumption, tributes or sacrifice, were as well something that could be verified, and this time quite empirically. Are there really 1,204 amphorae of wine in my cellar? Hey, servant, go do a quick head count for me. Did Utnapishtim really tell Gilgamesh to turn his back on agrarianism and all of its inequity and iniquity both? Well, everyone knows that this is the case. On the one side, we have the tradition. This epic speaks of these things and not those other. And on the adventitial side, we have the equally new sense that observation in real time could be its own discourse, completely apart from that mythic, and that's often in conflict with it. In the earliest of writings, then, we're talking about cuneiform tablets here, right? We see the original point of departure between religion and science, belief and thought, and idealism and empiricism. So right from the very beginning of writing, we have this incredible distinction that's being made even in its very incipience, the idea that one world and another world are coexisting, and yet they are about to lose their kind of overlap with one another. They're contiguous, and they may even be, for some people, contiguous to this day, but the old understanding, the old form of consciousness where there was one experience of both worlds at the same time, the spirit world and the human world, is beginning now to fall away. And it's because of the advent of writing itself. So language in use has changed not only the meanings of words, but the meaning of meaning itself, as well as what the structure of consciousness is. Okay, all of this is coming down to us. So as we move on, and I invite you to listen to part 3 when it appears, we'll be able to kind of more get a sense of why these kinds of authority exist. Even today, even in our own day, these forms of authority have really, truly ancient roots. And that's not to sort of say that, oh, okay, well, we must respect them then just because they're old. Not at all. There's a sense that we must come to know them and in their entirety before we can question their essence. Okay? Put the real questions to them and see just how well they answer for themselves in our own time. Thanks again.